updates from Hong Kong. Of course, I'm Almond. Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm a journalist based in Hong Kong, so welcome to the weekly show. So this week, I just want to say today is actually September 6th in Hong Kong, probably September 5th in the US or some other places. So today it was supposed to be our election day where we, hi Pablo, hi, thanks for joining. So yeah, today is supposed to be our elections to choose our lawmakers, but our election has been postponed for a year because of the pandemic. And on this very interesting and coincidental day, I want to talk about something. I want to give you the weekly happenings in Hong Kong, and one very, very interesting and also heated debate has been happening in Hong Kong is what we call separation of powers. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ideology. So basically, it's separation of powers is generally believed to be so the governance of a place is divided into three powers. That's executive, legislature, and also judiciary. And they are believed to have different and very distinct powers and functions that would, in a sense, that they would have, they could achieve check and balance between each other, so that not certain branches of the government would be holding excessive powers, basically. So, why do I want to talk about this? Because recently, just earlier this week, we have our chief executive, Carrie Lam, the leader of Hong Kong, basically declared that there is no such thing as separation of powers in Hong Kong. This means a huge deal to Hong Kong people, especially anti-government protesters or the pro-democracy camp or activist, if you will. So why is that? And also Carrie Lam earlier this week said that other than there's no separation of powers, she also stressed that Hong Kong is an executive-led government. It's led by the executive branch, which is her branch because she's the chief executive, meaning she would be in charge of the executive branch, right? So perhaps you will be like, so why all this fuss all of a sudden? It actually started from so it started by a decision by the government to review some liberal studies textbook, and they decided to, they asked the publishers to remove certain terms or certain topics in the textbook, and that includes separation of powers. And the reasons that authorities gave was that because there's no separation of powers in Hong Kong, so it would be inaccurate to include that in the textbooks and teach that to our students. So that's how basically the whole debate over separation of powers started in Hong Kong. So recently it has been, what exactly is separation of powers, and does it actually exist in Hong Kong? And if yes or no, then what does it mean? Or how does Hong Kong go forward from this, from a governance point of view or operation government point of view? So separation of powers, just like I explained just now, it's usually different and independent powers and functions by different branches, executive, legislature, and also judiciary. Judicial independence is something that we've all heard about, in Hong Kong, and how it has been, it's under erosion or whatnot, and it has been a very core value in Hong Kong, especially during the protest period. This term comes up a lot. But separation of powers seems to be a more foreign ideology, but it's actually not that foreign. And if you think of, so separation of powers usually, or we usually in modern days see in democracies, countries with democracies. So people would say usually, Hong Kong the special administrative region of China is not entirely a democracy, because we don't have a system in place where we can choose our leader, or nominate someone just on our own will. It's still chosen by the central government. So it's not like the U.S. where anybody could, the parties are voted by the people, they're chosen by the people, and instead from there they would choose someone to represent them. So Hong Kong is not exactly a full democracy, but we do have a high degree of autonomy, and we have a lot of autonomy and liberty in doing things, and we have a very independent, robust system in Hong Kong. And so the gist of having separation of powers is really to achieve checks and balance, which a lot of academics and critics that I've talked to also told me that, this is really the main point of separation of powers. It's not about separation of or division of labor. It's more than that. The spirit is to have checks and balance, because so that each of the branches would not abuse its powers. So it's sort of like the system that the U.S. has. For example, the Congress is the lawmaking body, and then the president would be the executive branch, of course, and then he would have the power to, for example, veto or pass a bill proposed by Congress, right? And then the court would come in and said that, if that law is unconstitutional, we can declare that unconstitutional, we can ban them, we could get rid of them. So each of them have a different, distinct, very unique set of powers, and the purpose, in effect, is to keep other branches checked and balanced, basically. So that is the gist. Let me just look at some comments. I just want to know, I pray for the people of Hong Kong and for China. Thank you so much, Sue's Petals, and supports Hong Kong. Thank you very much. So, right, let's get into... So, as I said, a lot of the debates also comes around the notion of, does it actually exist in Hong Kong then? When I talk to a lot of academics and politicians, they said that, there are different sayings, basically. Separation of powers, in essence, is a political ideology. It's not exactly like a set system in place in any countries, right? So it's more like a political ideology, that we need checks and balance, that we need different branches to do different things and have a balanced power circle or governance, so to speak. So one of the arguments that Chief Executive Carrie Lam has used in her declaration of there's no separation of powers in Hong Kong is that it's not written in the Basic Law. So Basic Law, it's like the mini constitution of Hong Kong. It's not exactly the constitution like of a country, but it's sort of like a mini constitution of the SAR, the Special Administrative Region. So she said it's not written in the Basic Law. She is not wrong on that, because there's really no such term as separation of powers. But a lot of legal experts and also politicians that I've talked to in Hong Kong told me that, true, they don't have the exact term separation of powers, but in some of the clauses, it actually spells out the essence and the spirit of separation of powers. For example, it would say that, the legislature could only do this. Legislature would be the only lawmaking body, meaning, the chief executive can't just make a law, can't just propose policy. She definitely could propose a policy, but it would have to go through the legislature. And also there are instances in the past where, for example, the court would declare wrongdoing of the leaders, or they would reject some of the policy or laws passed for example, recently is declaring the face mask, the face covering ban in Hong Kong that was introduced during the protest, unconstitutional. So we do see the practice of separation of powers in a sense, and also so lawyers and critics and academics have told me that the spirit of separation of powers, the gist of it, is actually very clearly written in the basic law, in the mini constitution. It's just that they didn't adopt the term separation of powers. So does it mean that separation of powers does not exist in Hong Kong just because it's not written in the law in its exact terms? It's probably not, according to a lot of critics and also academics, because if you really look into, there are also like judges in the past using the term separation of powers in their judgment. There are also politicians using that term, including pro-Beijing politicians, pro-Beijing figures nowadays. They have said that Hong Kong's governance we have a robust governance because we have separation of powers in place. There also, recently I've read a story about this. The government actually, back in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed over from the British to China, 1997, there were these documents or publications basically that was given to journalists on sort of like guidelines for them, and inside that document, inside that publications, separation of powers exists. It was inside. And it also said that, the Hong Kong governance would be based on separation of powers. It has the exact terms there. So, it's back in 1997. So at that time, Hong Kong would be already handed back to China. So it's part of China already. And the term separation of powers has already been used in official publications. So a lot of people are criticizing the government for, so-called rewriting things, saying that, why would you all of a sudden overthrow things that have been, written, spoken, used, or believed, and before referenced, and before, why would you suddenly say that, this is basically non-existent? And honestly, I talked to an education sector lawmaker in Hong Kong. Of course, he opposed taking out the terms or the topic separation of powers in liberal studies textbook. He told me that having separation of powers and, like Carrie Lam said, like our chief executive said, Hong Kong is an executive-led government. It's actually not mutually exclusive. You can still have separation of powers, but your government is mainly led by executive. It's led by executive branch, but it doesn't mean that you could still have separation of powers and you can still have checks and balance, is what politicians think. So let me get to some comments and questions. What does Hong Kong think of the USA election? I'm not sure, because recently there has been just, we can go into details of that, but how the US elections are sort of related to Hong Kong people would be who would win the election, who would be the president, and how would the US policies against perhaps China or Hong Kong in specific affect the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. So I think that's one of the main points a lot of Hong Kongers are, focusing on. There's also a question, isn't the Hong Kong legislation a joke anyway? Half of the LegCo are special interest corporate puppets that are pro-Beijing mouthpieces. Very strong comment there. It's true that some of the LegCo representatives, some of our lawmakers, we do have a very interesting section called Functional Constituency. We can get to that in more details perhaps in another episode, but basically those functional constituencies, they are business representatives, and they're not really elected by the people. There's no like general elections to choose people or choose representatives for these functional constituencies. So they could just be like a bunch of companies and of the industry. For example, you have the finance industry, or you have the textile industry, you have the F&B industry, the catering industry, and then it would be a bunch of like business groups, small shops or businesses. They would have the vote, and they would be the ones voting for that representative, to choose a representative to go into LegCo. And how do you feel about communism? Wow, that's a really complicated question. I would say it's communism and also democracy versus democracy. I mean, a lot of people think that they are, the complete opposite. I'm not denying that. But then there are also like good things and bad things about both of them. I think communism, in a sense, China started communism when it was in a very dire situation, where everyone is struggling to find jobs or to find enough money to feed their family. And so at that time, communism comes in and really help a lot of people and lift their livelihood, let them allow them to have the resources and the earnings that they need to live a life and to feed their family. So that's a good thing about it. But of course, so when you come to democracy or like capitalism, some people say, it's probably one of the reasons why we have such a wide wealth gap to capitalism, right? And also democracies sometimes could mean that those minority, really, really minority, would not have enough of a say in society because their voice is just so weak. So is it fair? Is it a good thing? I don't think so. But, so good and bads of different ideologies or different beliefs. So let's get back to the separation of powers, and thank you for the questions. I really appreciate it. So the reactions recently has been especially from pro-democracy camp. Like I said, they are saying that they're trying to rewrite things to make something that has been here in Hong Kong, has been referenced and believed, so widely believed by politicians, judges, and even government have said something like that, saying that, separation of powers is the core or is the base of Hong Kong's governance. Critics are now saying that the authorities, the executive-led government or the executive branch is trying to take dominance as well, because when they said executive-led, some people think that they are trying to imply that the executive branch is it's overpowering the other two branches, judiciary and also legislature. So critics are saying that the authorities are trying to diminish those boundaries that we have within the three powers that would be guaranteed under separation of powers. So they're trying to diminish those boundaries, blur those boundaries, and the executive branch would be trying to soaking up more powers and oversee the other two rather than working together. And also, academics have said that by declaring, oh, there's no such thing as separation of powers, just because it's not written in its exact term in the basic law, would mean it's sort of like the government is trying to make people to listen or to believe the wordings that officials use are the standard one or the correct one. As Carrie Lam said, we would like to right the wrongs. So because it's not written in the basic law, then it's a wrong thing to teach about. Yes, that's that. And the argument from the government officials, of course, they're saying that, oh, we should stop arguing over semantics because it's just, whether it's a few words to describe this ideology or, it's still, there are still check and balances between the three powers, even though we said that separation of powers doesn't exist because, we're still, our judiciary is still independent, so we're fine. But, people are seeing this of a more wider implication and impact if the government is able to change the rhetoric and said there's no separation of powers because it's not written in the law. Where, legal experts have said that, it's not in its exact terms, but it has been spelled out, so it actually still exists. And a lot of people see this as more than just a semantic thing. Rather, it's a conflict over or a fight over Hong Kong's autonomy and our freedoms, our liberties and everything. Judicial independence, throwing the important words here, because when the government is trying to shift the saying or the stance to said, there's never been separation of powers and is an executive-led government. They're trying to take dominance, like I said. And a lot of people, especially anti-government protesters, anti-Beijing protesters, they would think, well, since the current government, the executive, is such a puppet of Beijing, that's a lot of the sentiment felt by anti-government protesters, is that they are a puppet of Beijing. They're only taking orders from Beijing, from the central government, and that's why, they don't really trust the executive, they don't trust the government, and so they're worried. The implication would be, meaning the executive could take lead and take most of the powers, be the powerhouse in Hong Kong, and which the government would be answering to China and making Hong Kong just no longer a special administrative region with high degree of autonomy, but just a mainland city where China has full control over. So that's a worry from anti-government protesters as well as pro-democracy, politicians and activists. Let me get some questions here. Are younger Hong Kongers knowledgeable about and or advocating socialism, especially with the absurd housing prices and real estate developers hold over government? I think I'm not sure about socialism, like whether young people are more knowledgeable or advocating for socialism. I'm not sure about the advocacy part, probably not, because in Hong Kong, I guess, and especially if you look back in the protest that happened in the past year, it's more about getting, I would say, democracy, things that they want under the umbrella of democracy rather than socialism. For example, they want, universal suffrage, the right to choose their own leader, and things like that. So I would say they're still more on the spectrum of democracy rather than socialism. But you're absolutely right with the housing prices. It's even with the pandemic, I mean, the property prices in Hong Kong have dropped a little bit, but it's just by a little bit. And so I would agree with you. It's quite absurd in terms of housing prices, because Hong Kong is one of the most expensive places to live in the world. Thanks. Hi, Brad. Thanks for your question. Does Hong Kong even have any legal tools available when Beijing can just bully people into submission? For instance, is there a Hong Kong Supreme Court that could overrule the security laws authority? Very interesting question. We do have a Supreme Court. Ours is, so we didn't call it Supreme Court, but it's called the Court of Final Appeal, basically as quite literally final appeal. So it is the final step, it's a final level, the highest level of court that people could get to fight for justice or whatever. But the interesting thing when you mention the national security law is that it's actually not, there could never be a judicial review against the decision made by the National Security Office or officers. It's written in the national security law. One of the clauses is that it's not open to judicial challenges or reviews. So it's pretty much, I said so. So it's a done deal. That's it. So short answer is no. If you're talking about security law, national security law related issues. But we do have, judicial reviews, judicial challenges available to different, to different causes in society. Just other, you can still judicial challenge a piece of government policy, for example. Do you think there is a strong foreign influence in Hong Kong culture? For example, universities. I'm not understanding this question fully. What do you mean Hong Kong culture, and how does university affect? National security is designed to be vague so it can be used as a catch-all law to convict any dissidents that want silenced. That Beijing wants silence. I assume that's what you meant. Yes, I mean that's also part of the government's sort of, well, not argument, I guess you could say, when they try to explain to the public, because the interesting thing about the national security law is that all the details were only announced after it was enacted, or maybe a day, if I remember correctly, before it was supposed to be enacted. So the public is really, in a sense, kept in the blind when it comes to the details of the laws, because it has always just been, we'll just wait for the details. There's no reasons to be afraid. We'll just wait for the details to come out, and then we'll see the scope. But if you think about it, other legislature process would be, you would know the details of the law or the bill first, and then you decide, okay, this part we want to change, or this part we don't want to change, or we want to improve it. There are like changes, amendments to a bill before it would be passed into a law. Right, so when it comes to national security law, it's sort of a different process. So Hong Kongers don't know anything about the law until it was enacted. So there's really no chance for opposition or cry for amendment, for example. So have protests died down? In a sense, yes. The protests in Hong Kong have quietened down so much. I mean, here and there'll be like sporadic protests. There'll be, lunch rallies. Some people will gather in shopping malls sometimes, singing songs, singing the protest anthem, or chanting slogans and whatnot. But yeah, recently, I guess the most recent protest that we have would be the one back in August 31st. That's the Prince Edward incident. You can revisit our episode last week. We talked about that. So yeah, I mean, it has quietened down a lot, but it's going on in terms of, online. People are taking ads in newspaper to kind of voice their opinions and whatnot. So yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining this week's In a Nutshell with Almond, bringing you your weekly doses of Hong Kong updates from Hong Kong, from me, a Hong Kong journalist. So thank you so much for joining and all the questions and comments. I hope you are happy with this episode. And like usual, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to DM me. And if there's any specific topic that you are interested in and want me to cover, so DM me, let me know, or comment on this stream. I will definitely try to cover things that you guys are interested. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next week and bring you all the updates from Hong Kong in a nutshell with Almond. See you next week. Bye.